for inviting me to read. This is an excerpt from chapter 1 of my novel, Truth Be Told. The two main characters, Alice Powell and Sue Ellen Kramer, are best friends. The narrative is written in Alice's voice. Sue Ellen had plans to meet with J.R. on Friday morning, October 10th, 1980, to end their affair. She promised me a phone call that evening to let me know how it went. Eager to get home for her call that chilly Friday night, I wolfed down some hors d'oeuvres and chugged a draft beer at the brew house happy hour with some folks from the office where I worked. Once home and settled on my red blue plaid sofa, Sadie, my Sheltie, jumped up and snuggled beside me. Both the couch and the dog were part of what I had acquired when my husband, Stephen Powell, and I divvied up our stuff 2 years ago. We separated after a 6-year marriage because of an affair. Just months after I had left Stephen, the Kramer family, Sue Ellen, her husband Bob, and their 10-year-old daughter Elizabeth also moved out of Hampton, Virginia. Bob had a job offer he said he couldn't refuse at a manufacturing plant in Sydney, North Carolina. The good news was that they would be closer to Sue Ellen's parents, only a day's drive to Geneva, Georgia. But Sue Ellen and I would be farther apart than ever. In the 6 years we had both lived in Hampton, Sue Ellen looked out for me as if she were my mother, and I needed it. When I was out of her care for an 8-week training class, I got myself into trouble. When she didn't have me in her life, she took on a lover. When we were together, we held each other accountable for our actions. Sue Ellen heard my worst stories and loved me in spite of them. On summer nights, we sipped wine and shared secrets on her back porch. Sue Ellen knew me so well, I could never lie to her. She'd stare me down until the truth came from my lips. Like children, we giggled, ran barefoot in the grass, and made snow babies with Elizabeth, with the scant bit of the white stuff that fell in the Tidewater area of Virginia. We listened to each other, we didn't judge, and we wiped away each other's tears. Better than therapy, Sue Ellen always said of our bond. While I waited for her promised call on that Friday, I watched Jeopardy! Sue Ellen and I used to watch Jeopardy! Together on nights that our husbands worked their part-time jobs at the H&R Block office in downtown Hampton. Sue Ellen's top 3 categories were art, her college major, the Bible. As a Southern Baptist, she read and lived in the Word daily, and the Confederacy. One of her life goals was to visit every cemetery where boys who wore the gray were buried. I didn't have any special favorites, but I was good at things such as potpourri, literature, and word origins. Most of those nights, we each held a clicker from my boxed edition of Jeopardy! Hovering on the edge of our seats, we waited for our Art Fleming, Sue Ellen's daughter Elizabeth, to tell us who would be first to shout out our answer. But Sue Ellen and I had bickered so much that Elizabeth, when she got older, just up and walked off the job one day, in the middle of Double Jeopardy, in the Tournament of Champions. On the Friday night I was waiting for her call, the final Jeopardy! Category was art history. The answer? The term Impressionism was derived from his painting, Impression Sunrise. I squealed because I knew the question, and that is precisely when the phone rang. I answered in my haughtiest voice. Who is Claude Monet? Alice, it's Bob Kramer. Bob's voice pierced my heart. He would never call me unless something had happened to Sue Ellen. Is Sue Ellen all right? First there was silence, then the sound of Bob struggling to speak, trying to catch his breath. Oh, Alice, oh my God, Sue Ellen's gone, he sobbed. I sighed, relieved. Maybe she had left Bob. Maybe she and J.R. had run off together after all. Maybe he did love her. Gone? Where did she go, I asked. Bob always mumbled, but on the phone that night it was impossible to understand what he was trying to tell me. Who's with you, I asked. Is Elizabeth there? No, I couldn't let her come home to this, he stuttered. Pastor Smedley took her to the house after school, to his house after school. I don't understand. Please, tell me slowly what happened. Okay, Bob, can you do that, I said. His voice wavered, but he managed to say, Sue Ellen is dead, Alice. She's dead. Sue Ellen is dead? The words pounded in my head and vomit rose in my throat. On the other end of the line, Bob gurgled and moaned. I imagined his hand trembling as he grasped the phone. Bob said that Sue Ellen had called him around 11 o'clock that morning and asked him to come home for lunch, something she had never done before. She needed to talk to him. She said it was urgent. At about 12:15, he arrived home, found the door unlocked, and their huge mutt, Curly, whimpering just inside. He called out for Sue Ellen and thought he heard her cough. When he walked down the hall and into the kitchen, he found her on the floor with a .25 caliber pistol in her hand and blood all over her. Bob kneeled down, touched her still warm body, pulled himself up on unsteady legs, and called 911 from the wall phone in the kitchen. And then he ran out of the room, sick to his stomach. Within minutes, an ambulance, a fire engine, and a police car pulled in front of the house. Someone must have called Pastor Smedley, Sue Ellen's counselor, because he arrived just before the coroner showed up. Curly was so out of control by the time the pastor walked through the front door that Bob had to lock him in the laundry room. After a few hours, they hauled Sue Ellen out of the house in a black body bag on a gurney. Yellow tape marked off the side of the kitchen where her body had lain in a pool of blood. She died from a single gunshot wound to the head. There was no note. The police talked to Dr. Smedley, who advised them that he had been counseling her for more than a year and that Sue Ellen had been depressed. The police chief and the pastor were of the opinion that Sue Ellen shot herself, but the coroner couldn't make a determination until he could prove that the wound was self-inflicted and find out if there was any evidence to support the fact that Sue Ellen had intended to take her life. Since she left no note and her husband was not aware of any such intentions, there would have to be an investigation, possibly including an autopsy. But more than likely, Bob told me, they were going to call it a suicide and close the case. I shouted into the receiver, "A suicide? Wait, did they check Sue Ellen's fingers for gunpowder? Did they check yours? Isn't that the first thing they do when there's a suspicious death?" I grew up watching Dragnet with Perry Mason, and I'd seen enough of Magnum PI to know that that's what investigators would do first. But sometimes in smaller rural towns, I knew they didn't do things by the books. Surely Bob was under duress. He must have gotten it wrong. Bob didn't acknowledge my questions. Instead, he turned the conversation to Elizabeth. I promised I would call and talk to Elizabeth later when I pulled myself together. Once I hung up, I sat down, closed my eyes, and talked to Sue Ellen. "Come on, girl, let me know what went down. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. You were supposed to be calling me tonight. You, not Bob. You didn't do it, did you? You're only 32 fucking years old. How could you leave Elizabeth like that? How could you leave me?" "It had to be that guy, that JR. But I can't go after him because you had to protect his goddamn important identity." I needed someone to be with me, so I called my friend Jeannie from work. She promised she'd be there in a half hour. I had barely laid the receiver down when the phone rang again. When I picked it up to answer it, all I heard was static, and I hung up. It happened again and again. Some fool pulling a prank on me at a time like this was not amusing. I angrily answered the fourth one and was surprised to hear what sounded like a woman's voice. Distorted, more rhythmic than, and twice as fast as a normal voice, as if she were speaking through some kind of machine. "Tell Elizabeth I would never leave her. Tell her I love her." "Sue Ellen?" I shouted into the phone in a shaky voice. I shuddered, hugged myself, and rubbed the goosebumps on my arms. By the time Jean arrived, I had 5 more phone calls, 3 static, 2 with that same voice, that same message. I kept refilling my wine glass until I had knocked off a large bottle of Lambrusco by myself, and then took some hits from a joint Jean had brought. I waited until I felt sufficiently high to share the stories of the weird calls with Jean. By then, I was almost hysterical. Losing Sue Ellen was upsetting. Thinking about how she died was horrific. Add to that the spine-chilling call from my deceased friend, and I was out of control. "I'm going crazy," I slurred. "How could she be dead? How could she have pulled the trigger? And how could she be talking to me?" "Sue Ellen loves you and has something important she needs to say to her best friend. Don't be afraid." Jean sat beside me, held my hand, and convinced me that I wasn't going insane. She said she believed that anything was possible, especially in times of extraordinary trauma. Then, without telling me, she turned the ringer on my phone off. I leaned back against the sofa, closed my eyes, and played back the words I might have heard through the receiver, repeatedly. Finally, I convinced myself they actually were coming to me from Sue Ellen because of her psychic energy, her adrenaline, and her intense fear at the moment of her death. If anyone could figure out a way to reach out and comfort her daughter, Sue Ellen would be the one to do it. With God's help, if she calls again, I prayed that I would hear her words with sparkling clarity.